For years, it looked like you were losing. You gave more than you received, tolerated more than you should have, and stayed longer than anyone else would. You absorbed what others refused to face, carried emotions that were never yours, and remained silent in moments where speaking would have changed everything. And somewhere along the way, you were told the same thing over and over again, that you were too sensitive, too emotional, too affected by things that others seemed to handle effortlessly. But what if none of that was weakness? What if what looked like suffering was actually preparation? Because for years, empaths have existed in a world that quietly trained them to doubt their own nature. They became the ones who felt everything others avoided, who carried emotional weight that did not belong to them, who stayed silent in moments where truth would have created discomfort, and who absorbed impact after impact without ever being acknowledged for what they were holding together. Their depth was labeled as weakness. Their awareness was mistaken for fragility. And over time, they adapted to that narrative without even realizing it. They learned to minimize their reactions, to question their instincts, to explain away behavior that made them uneasy, to take responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to carry. They became the emotional stabilizers in unstable environments, the ones who made things easier for everyone else while becoming more disconnected from themselves. But what no one saw, not even them at first, was that this phase was not just survival, it was training. Because while it looked like they were losing, something else was happening beneath the surface. Every experience they went through was shaping a level of awareness that could not be developed any other way. Every time they encountered dishonesty, they became more attuned to inconsistency. Every time they experienced manipulation, they began to understand the structure behind it. Every time they were used, dismissed, or overlooked, they were unconsciously studying the patterns of behavior that drive people who operate from ego, insecurity, and control. What appeared to be emotional overwhelm was actually data collection. What looked like vulnerability was actually exposure to human nature in its most unfiltered form. And slowly, without any conscious decision, they began to build something most people never develop: a deep, instinctive understanding of how people think, how they act, and how they reveal themselves over time. The world they were moving through did not reward this kind of awareness. It rewarded speed, control, detachment, and the ability to move through situations without emotional involvement. It favored those who could prioritize themselves without hesitation, who could operate without absorbing consequences, who could navigate relationships without internal conflict. And for a long time, it seemed like those were the people who succeeded. Meanwhile, the empaths struggled, trying to apply depth in a system that did not value it. They believed that if they understood people well enough, they would be protected, that if they were patient enough, things would eventually balance out, that if they gave enough, they would receive. But over time, a quiet realization began to form. The rules they were living by were not universal truths. They were patterns, and patterns can be broken. The shift does not happen all at once. It builds slowly, beneath awareness, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. It begins with recognition. The moment patterns become visible in a way they never were before, everything starts to reorganize internally. What once felt confusing begins to feel predictable. What once felt personal begins to feel structured. The same behaviors appear across different people. The same dynamics repeat in different forms. And suddenly, the empath is no longer overwhelmed by what they experience. They understand it. And this is the moment everything begins to reverse. For years, it looked like the empath was the one being affected, the one being drained, the one being controlled by the emotional environment around them. But now, the same awareness that once overwhelmed them becomes the reason they can no longer be controlled. Because once you can see patterns clearly, they lose their power over you. Once you recognize behavior as predictable, it stops being personal. Once you understand the structure behind manipulation, it stops being effective. And this is where the comeback truly begins, not as an external victory, but as an internal shift that changes everything. This is what Carl Jung understood about the human psyche. He recognized that when something is pushed to its extreme, it does not simply collapse. It transforms into its opposite. The qualities that were once suppressed do not disappear. They return, but in a different form. The person who is endlessly giving becomes selectively generous. The one who stayed silent develops a voice that is direct and grounded. The one who tolerated everything develops boundaries that are firm and non-negotiable. This is not a loss of identity. It is the integration of it. Because no individual can remain whole while rejecting half of themselves, And for many empaths, what they rejected was not darkness, it was strength. For most of their lives, they were taught to distrust that strength. They were told that anger made them wrong, that boundaries made them selfish, that choosing themselves made them no different from the people who hurt them. So they suppressed it. They became agreeable, accommodating, endlessly understanding. They chose harmony over truth, connection over authenticity, peace over self-respect. But over time, the cost of that pattern became impossible to ignore, because what they believed was kindness was often self-abandonment. What they believed was patience was often avoidance. What they believed was empathy was sometimes an inability to walk away. And eventually, something inside reaches a point where it refuses to continue operating that way. When that point is reached, the shift is immediate and undeniable. The empath who once hesitated begins to act without explanation. The one who once gave endless chances begins to withdraw access. The one who once tried to fix everything begins to observe without intervening. And this is where the real transformation becomes visible. Because they have not lost their ability to understand people. They have refined it. They still see what others miss. They still read emotional dynamics with precision. They still recognize patterns before they fully unfold. But now, instead of using that awareness to help, to fix, or to absorb, they use it to decide, to choose who has access, to choose what deserves their energy, to choose where their attention goes, and anything that does not align is removed without hesitation. This is what makes the empath's comeback so powerful. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it does not rely on confrontation or validation. It is precise, controlled, and final. The manipulator who once created confusion is now seen clearly within moments. The inconsistency that once caused self-doubt is now recognized instantly. The emotional pressure that once worked no longer has any effect, because the empath is no longer participating in the same dynamic. And without participation, those dynamics collapse. Control requires access. Manipulation requires engagement. And once those are removed, the structure cannot sustain itself. In practical terms, this transformation shows up in ways that seem simple, but carry enormous weight. Conversations become shorter and more intentional. Boundaries become clear and enforced without explanation. Decisions are made without hesitation. The empath no longer explains themselves to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They no longer stay in environments that drain them. They no longer give chances to patterns that have already revealed themselves. There is no longer a need to argue, to convince, or to prove, because clarity has replaced confusion, and with clarity comes action. And this shift is not only personal, it reflects something larger happening in the world. The qualities that were once dismissed, emotional intelligence, awareness, sensitivity, are becoming essential in an increasingly complex and interconnected environment. The ability to understand people deeply, to read what is not being said, to recognize patterns before they escalate, these are no longer optional skills. They are advantages. The same traits that once made empaths feel out of place are now positioning them exactly where they need to be, not as victims of the system, but as individuals who can navigate it with a level of awareness others do not possess. But the true power of this transformation is not found in dominance or control. It is found in independence. Because you cannot control someone who sees clearly and does not depend on your validation. You cannot manipulate someone who recognizes your patterns before they unfold. You cannot drain someone who knows exactly when to walk away. And you cannot destabilize someone who has already faced the parts of themselves they once avoided. This is what Jung described as individuation, the process of becoming internally complete, the point where external forces lose their ability to define your internal state. The empath who reaches this stage does not need validation, does not need approval, does not need to be understood by everyone. They operate from a level of certainty that does not require explanation. And that certainty changes everything about how they move through the world. The final realization is simple.